Before we begin the episode, I've got a real quick message from the person who requested this video. Hey there, fellow members of the Orbital platform, Marluxia is a girl here. I've always loved the Duel Terminal lore as well as any other lore in the game. I hope you enjoy this month's pick. After all, it is only one side of this coin of fate. Hello everyone, GoldenNova here. Today, we've got a request from one of the Patreon's Quasar Commanders, and while they don't have to fit this month's theme, this one certainly does. Last month we covered the Qliphorts, mechanical ships that help to run the Tree of Life, but now it's time to take a look at the other side of that coin. Premiering in the May 2015 core set, Crossed Souls, Zefra appeared as an answer to the rise of the Infernoids and the overwhelming power of El Shaddai Anoyatilis. In the presence of so many powerful artifacts and beings, including the Dragoonity Divine Lance and the Spirit of Sophia being channeled through Necro Cloth, the Sephiroth system activated, granting its power to 10 chosen warriors in an attempt to save the planet. This would open up some pretty cool mechanical ideas in the actual game, and while pure Zefra wouldn't make much of an impact, as with many archetypes, bits and pieces would find themselves into other themes to help bolster their own game plans. And by other decks, I mean the Pendulum Slurry. So let's gather our forces to see what we're working with, draw up our battle plans to fell a god, then see if there are any other chosen warriors in far-off lands that we can beseech for aid. Get ready to bring the story of Duel Terminal to a close, at least for now, with Zefra Explained. Today's episode is brought to you by my lovely patrons and the fine people over at Dragon Shield. If you want to protect your cards with the strongest scales on the market that even come with their own lore while supporting the channel, use my affiliate link in the description. So what's the deal with Zefras? Well, the astounding thing is a majority of them can be found across other themes. The 10 chosen warriors were taken from 5 existing factions: the Shaddals, Yang Xing, Tellarknights, Necros, and Ritual Beasts. Each of these themes were given 2 Zefra Monsters, and they have a couple of things in common. Each one of them is either a scale 1 or 7, which is pretty wide, but comes with a catch. Their pendulum effect keeps you from pendulum summoning anything except Zefra Monsters, as well as their secondary archetype, and this effect cannot be negated. This means you could put the 2 Tellarknight Zefras into your Tellarknight deck to give them access to pendulum summoning, but if you have a Shaddal and a Necros in scale, you're only pendulum summoning Zefra, which leads to this cool design option where you can play them as their own thing, or just take the relevant parts and add them to their own archetype and enhance the deck that way, though to this day that playstyle hasn't really caught on. That covers what they all have in common. Now let's take a look at the specifics. Shaddal Zefra Naga is a level 2 Dark Spellcaster monster with 900 attack, 100 defense, and a scale of 1. If this card is pendulum summoned or is sent to the graveyard, you can target a card in either pendulum zone and return it to the hand, but you must have a Zefra card in your pendulum zone to activate and resolve this effect. Since this hits any pendulum zone, this can potentially disrupt an opponent's scales, though normally this will only be helpful if those scales have continuous effects you want to turn off during your own turn, because in most cases they'll just be able to replay them on their turn. Bouncing our own scales, though, is pretty killer. It essentially allows us to turn off part of our summoning restriction to replace it with a different scale. After all, if you run better scales that don't restrict you, you'd much rather have those active, since our monsters honestly make for pretty lousy scales. Or, if you just need the monster for a particular summon, this helps to get it out of the scales to do so. But golly, it's hard to see Evil Swarm Kirkion in this state. They used to be the scourge of Rogue. Now you can barely get a jank player to touch them. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Zefra Shi, Treasure of the Yang Xing, is a level 3 Earthworm monster with 1500 attack, 0 defense, and a scale of 1. If pendulum summoned or special summoned from the main deck, you can target a Yang Xing or Zefra monster you control, except copies of this card, and that face-up monster is treated as a tuner for the rest of the turn, but place this card on the bottom of the deck when it leaves the field. This comprises our tuner access, and it's a damn good card for it, letting us be very flexible with what we get to use as material. It also thankfully doesn't restrict us, so we can make basically any synchro we want. It's annoying that it goes back to the deck instead of our face-up extra deck, but we have plenty of ways to cheat it back into play, both in Yang Xing and Zefra. It may look like a giant rock statue, not worth more than the stone it's carved from, but it's the synchros it enables and the game-breaking plays you can do that are the real treasure. Ritual Beast Tamer Zefra Wendy is a level 3 wind psychic monster with 1500 attack, 1000 defense, and a scale of 7. When this card is normal or pendulum summoned, you can add a face-up Zefra monster from your extra deck to your hand, except a copy of this card. And you can only special summon copies of this card once per turn, keeping in line with how the Ritual Beast deck operates. That might seem like an odd restriction, but give my Ritual Beast video a watch and you'll see why it's a good thing it has it. This is a nice way to recycle your resources, especially since now that we're under Master Rule Revision 4, we'll want as many monsters we intend to summon in hand as possible to avoid needing link arrows. However, this does mean it's almost exclusively going to be used in Zefra, because when it comes to Ritual Beasts, this is little more than another name, and those aren't really in short supply. But it is good to see these two free of Shaddoll influence. They're still a heck of a lot more useful than Wendigo ever was. Ugh. Ritual Beast Zefra Ampilica is a level 3 wind psychic monster with 1000 attack, 1500 defense, and a scale of 1. When this card is normal or pendulum summoned, you can target a Ritual Beast or Zefra monster in your grave, except a copy of this card, and special summon it, but destroy it during the end phase. And you can also only special summon copies of these once per turn. Now, this card has a bit more oomph to it. It might seem strange for a Zefra card, you know, from the pendulum deck, to care about special summoning from the grave, but there are a lot of ways for those to end up in there. And outside that, it's great in the Ritual Beast deck itself because it's another normal summon that can help you get materials to really Zeframpilica up your plays. Stellar Knight Zefraxiton is a level 4 light fiend monster with 1900 attack, 0 defense, and a scale of 7. And if this card is normal, flip, or pendulum summoned, you can target one other Stellar Knight or Zefra card in your monster zone or pendulum zone and a set card your opponent controls and destroy them. This is going to be your primary form of removal, specifically against your opponent's hidden cards. And while it can target Stellar Knight cards on top of Zefra as your half of the deal, you'll find this absolutely sucks in tellers. Like, if you can establish a scale and pendulum out your good ones, Zefraxiton can act as a pretty good chain blocker if your opponent has a board set up with a valid target. But notice that the effect doesn't work on just any special summon, just pendulum summons. And that's a problem because the base plan of tellers is to chain summons together, you know, Vega into Altair into Deneb, and bam, you have 3 Xyz material with a search on top of it. Zefraxiton would have made for a really good topper for the chain like Deneb is, but it just doesn't activate like that. So unless you've somehow managed to get good scales and the monster needed to make a profitable pendulum summon, you're going to have to waste your normal summon to trigger this, and that's just not gonna fly. But you know, this isn't the Stellar Knight video, it's the Zefra one, and in that, it's not bad. Pendulum summoning is the name of the game, so having some extra removal on top of that can potentially wipe out our own scales so we can replace them with better ones is pretty handy. In fact, while we're at it, we might as well cover Stellar Knight Zefra Thubin, a level 4 light warrior monster with 0 attack, 2100 defense, and a scale of 1, that basically has the same text as Zefraxiton, but targets your opponent's face-up cards instead of set, making this a wildly better option. Basically, they form a duo that gives us important removal that doesn't really translate into their home theme, which is sad because if any deck needed spot removal, it was Stellar Knights. But despite that, Exciton Knight Paladin mode and Reverse Furry Yangzing Chiwen will always have a home with us. Zefra Saber, Sword Master of the Necros, is a level 4 water spellcaster monster with 1500 attack, 800 defense, and a scale of 1. And you can tribute this card from your hand or face-up field to tribute monsters from your hand or field, then ritual summon a Necros monster from your hand whose level exactly equals the total level of those monsters tributed. This makes Zefra Saber the long sought-after 4th ritual spell of Necros, working in a very off-kilter way, which is very helpful. It actually saw a small stint of playability back when Necros were the king of the hill, and people were playing anti-spell fragrance against it. Zefra Saber helped to avoid this because, as a monster, it didn't really care about that. And if you summoned a monster like Trishula or Gungnir with it, you could actually remove the floodgate to unlock your entire strategy. That being said, this really is just a Necros card. Like, none of the effect text does anything for Zefra, and essentially implies you'll have to play the Necros rituals in this deck if you include it. Now, technically, our field spell does reward us for doing this, so it's not a complete wash, but it honestly just isn't worth it. Maybe during the next Grail War, we'll get a class better suited to help us out. I'm thinking Zefra Caster myself. Zefra Core is a level 4 Dark Rock monster with 450 attack, 1950 defense, and a scale of 7. And if this card is pendulum summoned or sent to the grave, you can target a Zefra card in your pendulum zone and special summon it. That's actually a pretty cool effect, even though we aren't going to get any on summon effects because most of them require them to be pendulum summoned. but it does still clear out our scales and gives us a free monster to do with whatever we want. Heck, as desperate as we are to make monsters like Beyond the Pendulum before we pendulum summon, this is actually a pretty tasty effect. And something we haven't mentioned yet is, unlike the rest of the Shaddoll stock, the Zefra ones trigger when sent to the graveyard by any means, not just effect, so you can discard this for cost to your heart's content and still get value. But they also completely abandon the flip mechanic, so despite how much of a win this card is, comparatively, they're a huge flavor fail. Zefraxa, Flame Beast of the Necros, is a level 5 Fire Dragon monster with 2000 attack, 1000 defense, and a scale of 7. While this card is in your hand or grave, if any number of face-up Necros or Zefra cards, except copies of this card, are destroyed by battle or card effect while in your monster or pendulum zone, you can special summon this card. So yeah, another free body. It combos well with our Tellarknight Zefra, and if we're on ritual summons, we're gonna want to tribute this directly from the hand so you can use its revival effect from the grave. If this was a more modern archetype, this would work well face up in the extra deck, but we work with what we have, not what we can custom. Honestly, it's a shame it doesn't match any of our other levels, because this would work extremely well as Xyz material, since that's the only extra deck mechanic we can utilize that gets this back into the graveyard after it's been summoned. But despite my gripes, it still makes for a good synchro material once we get treasure into rotation to make us a tuner, and I honestly think that the water-based Necros having a character swap to fire is pretty cool. After all, who else is going to keep up Flamvel Grunica's trend of not wearing appropriate footwear to battle? Zefra New, Secret of the Yangzing, is a level 6 Earthworm monster with 0 attack, 2600 defense, and a scale of 7. When this card is pendulum summoned, or when this card is destroyed by a battle or card effect while in the monster zone, you can add a Yangzing or Zefra Speller Trap card from your deck to your hand. Of the Zefra, this is arguably the most splashed. While our Yangzing spells and traps are wanting for impact, we have quite a few fantastic Zefra ones that work even with a minimal amount of Zefra monsters, partly because New exists. And unlike Treasure, this actually goes back to our extra deck when it leaves the field, giving us this great resource loop of pendulum summoning it, getting a search, it gets blown up on our opponent's turn, you get a search, then on your turn you pendulum summon it, you get a search. You can see where this is going. It's a fantastic card in any pendulum deck it finds itself in, which is a bit of a paradox because its usefulness is certainly no secret. Alright, that covers all the Zefras based on other themes. Now it's time for something less derivative, though not by much. Zefrath is a level 11 Earth Rock monster with 3450 attack, 2950 defense, and a scale of 5. As a pendulum spell, during your main phase, you can add a Zefra pendulum monster from your deck to your extra deck face up, and if you do, change this card's scale to be the same as that pendulum monster's until the end of this turn, effectively making Zefrath either a high or low scale on demand, depending on what you need. As a monster, it can't be normal summoned or set, and must be special summoned from your face-up extra deck by tributing all monsters you control, including at least 3 Zefra monsters, and can't be special summoned by other ways. After you special summon this card, you can conduct a pendulum summon of any number of Zefra monsters during your main phase, in addition to your pendulum summon, and once per turn, you contribute a monster to special summon a Zefra monster from your deck. Now, as a monster, this has the capability of being exceedingly strong. Letting you perform 2 pendulum summons is, honestly, outrageous, and turning any monster into the Zefra of your choice can help with you smoothing out your lineup to enhance your extra deck plays, while also growing your extra deck for a great pendulum summon. However, it's just not gonna hold water in today's game. Because you have to tribute all of your monsters, and because it's summoned from the face-up extra deck as a pendulum monster, you'll have to summon it to your extra monster zone, because you won't have any arrows to open up to your main monster zones. Unless your opponent is giving you an arrow, but that's not something you can rely on, which means you can only pendulum summon from your hand, which defeats the whole purpose of gaining those pendulum summons. Heck, you only get the extra pendulum summon during the turn you special summon it, so you can't even do anything goofy like copying it with Phantom of Darkness. That being said, as a scale, this card is phenomenal. It loads up your extra deck so you can go as low as scale 1, and even after doing that, doesn't limit your pendulum summons. So if we have an unrestricted high scale, you can pendulum summon any monster you want, zones providing, of course. So let your imagination wander and cook up something that'll really show the wrath of Zefrath. And our last monster is... Oh, I don't want to do this. Okay, with Zefrath basically out of commission, a new boss monster would have to step in. One that would help bring Pendulum into a new post-Link era. And for that job, they appointed a card that makes me look like a fool every time I bring it up, Zefra Metaltron. a Link 3 light worm monster with 2500 attack, requiring 2+ monsters special summoned from the extra deck. If any number of monsters this card points to that were special summoned from the extra deck are destroyed by battle or an opponent's card effect, you can add a monster from your grave or face-up pendulum monster from your extra deck to your hand. And it can also target a monster on each player's field that was special summoned from the extra deck except itself, and banish both until the end phase. As a monster, well, it does give you 3 downward pointing arrows. So, I mean, good for it. Replacing a monster is kinda cool, but since the effect destruction has to be your opponent's, you can't trigger this yourself unless you do a little bit of battle phase crashing, which seems antithetical to how pendulums usually operate. The removal being pseudo-banishing is kinda neat, but only hitting extra deck summoned monsters is a bit limiting. And since it's not a quick effect, it's not good at disruption either. Broadly, this is a Link 3 that gives you good zones to pendulum summon too, with some utility effects stapled on there for good measure. Nothing super special, and honestly, we have better off-theme options nowadays. But I just can't ignore it, because it's Zefra Metaltron. You know, like Metaltron 12, the true Drake combatant from the Draco Slayer lore, a story that has for a long time been completely separate from any other lore. At least until recently, when Master Duel decided to throw Dragon Alchemy into the mix, tying it in with Albaz lore. But you try telling this community about clear and obvious connections like this and see what happens. Call me Captain Ahab, because this card is my white whale, because there's nothing more frustrating than seeing such an obvious lore connection right in front of us and still not being given a single reason as to why it exists. Alright, so that's all of our monsters. Now we can cover the spells and traps. Zefra Providence is a normal spell card that adds a Zefra card from your deck to your hand, except a copy of itself. And if any number of Zefra cards you control would be destroyed, except the turn this card was sent to the grave, you can banish this card from your grave instead. Yeah, it's basically 3 automatic slots in any Zefra deck. It turns into anything you could want, and provides that destruction protection, helping to keep your scales intact. It's also the capstone of Age 3.0 in the Duel Terminal storyline, showing the time when Gem Knight Crystal escorts Gem Knight Lapis into the afterlife, going to join others who have given their lives to the many conflicts of this world. And it's just devastating that Lazuli has to watch them move on like that. Seriously, if anyone has to ask why I get so caught up on the card lore in this game, this is why. It's so... words would sully it. There's too much hope and sadness and melancholy all wrapped up in this one image. I'm not crying, you're crying! Zefra Path is a continuous spell card that you can only activate if you have 2 Zefra cards in your Pendulum Zone, with active scales 1 and 7. If this card is activated, you can shuffle all monsters you control into the deck that are not Zefras, and while on the field, neither player can special summon monsters except from the hand or extra deck. While you have cards in the Pendulum Zone, this card can't be targeted by card effects, but is destroyed if any cards in your Pendulum Zone are destroyed. Alright, it's Floodgate time! Though honestly, it's a pretty bad one. Your opponent can't special summon from the main deck or graveyard, but still has access to the extra deck. So if they have the materials to utilize it already in their hand, this isn't really doing much. It can certainly make for a good targeted side pick against certain decks. There are a few where this restriction can be absolutely backbreaking, but combined with its rough setup and easy removal, it's hard to recommend. But it does show the purification of Wen, bringing them back from the possession of the Shadal. And you know what that means? No more Wendigo. I don't care if I've already harped on it before, that fusion is such a nothing card, and an attribute that's already desperate for really good cards. So the sooner the concept of the Windishadal goes away, the better. Oracle of Zefra is a field spell card, and when activated, adds a Zefra monster from your deck to your hand. And when you ritual summon or perform a special summon using a Zefra monster, you can activate one of these effects once per turn, depending on the monster summoned. For rituals, you shuffle a monster on the field into the deck. For fusion, you can special summon a monster from your hand. With Synchro, you can choose a monster in your deck and place it on top of your deck, and if it succeeds, you can draw a card, then discard a card. So what's amazing about this is that it's searchable by Zefra Providence, making this 3 more copies of any Zefra monster, which makes them even more splashable. These other effects don't get used much off theme, but for us, they're a nice little perk. Non-targeting shuffling a monster off a ritual summon is a neat way to chain block, but once again, you'd have to be running rituals here, which doesn't seem ideal. Now, when it comes to the rest of those effects, they actually kind of feed into each other. Summon a fusion monster, and you get a card out of your hand that can potentially lead to a synchro or Xyz summon. Perform a synchro summon, and you can set up just the right card off of the Xyz draw. Heck, you can even grab a powerful hand trap to ensure you have it on later turns. There's also been some usage with this combined with the spell card Set Rotation. If you run any other field spell, you can use this to give yourself a field spell and give your opponent Oracle, a card they likely won't be able to activate because the search on it is mandatory. So if they aren't running one, it means they can't play any field spells as per Set Rotation's text. This card is just full of surprises, not least of which being that the Holy Life-Giving Tree is connected to the evil Soul-Devouring one. I mean, metaphysically, I can see the logic, but, like, from a mechanical standpoint, you're putting the starting town right next to the final dungeon there. That seems a little precarious. Zefra War is a normal trap card that targets one other Zefra card you control and a card your opponent controls, and destroys them. And if you have 2 Zefra cards in your pendulum zones, you can activate this card from your hand. Sweet, some on-demand removal just for playing the deck as usual. And if you already have everything you need for your setup, Providence can be used to search this into your hand to threaten your opponent's field without even having to commit this to the board. And if you use it on a future turn, Providence can even protect the Zefra card you target during that exchange, making this 1-for-1 removal. Guess we finally found out what War was good for. Zefra Divine Strike is a counter trap card that can be activated in response to a spell card, trap card, or monster effect activation. Banish a Zefra monster from your extra deck to negate the activation, and if you do, destroy it. This is the card you'll more than likely be seeing when it comes to Pendulum Piles, because it's a pretty free and easy Omni-Negate. Simply search this off of Zefra Neo, preferably by destroying it, because now it's safely tucked away in your extra deck to be used as fuel for Divine Strike. It's powerful, easy to grab, and with the recent unbanning of Denglong, can even see play in synchrocentric decks that can weave it in. But my favorite thing about this card is that the art shows Necroz of Sophia, Tellarknight Ptolemaeus, and the Dragoonity Divine Lance, 3 cards that are not, get this, Zefra cards. So whose Divine Strike is it? Our last card is Chosen of Zefra, a continuous trap card that gains effects depending on the number of face-up Zefra monsters with different names in your extra deck. With 3 or more, monsters you control gain 100 attack for each face-up card in your extra deck. With 5 or more, monsters you control can't be destroyed by an opponent's card effect. With 8 or more, monsters you control can't be targeted by your opponent's card effects. And with 10, you can send this card to the graveyard to shuffle all cards from your opponent's hand, field, and grave into the deck. In effect, that, while not a direct parallel to any of the creator star gods, is pretty similar to them. Now, as far as win conditions though, this is about as good as it gets. For us. The attack gain can be pretty staggering spread across a variety of monsters. Gaining targeting and destruction protection makes all of our monsters that much more powerful, and the final effect basically wins us the game so long as we can finish them off before they draw a starter. That being said, it doesn't actually help advance our game state, so it really is just a passive buff. But still, it's not the worst, especially since A, Providence can search and protect this, and B, this applies to all of our monsters, not just Zefra's. So if we branch out to off-theme monsters, they benefit from all of this as well. Imagine taking this into Pendulum Magicians and giving these bonuses to all of those associated monsters. The downside is, well, you have to play every Zefra except maybe Swordmaster, to reach the highest level of this card, and without any kind of mass pendulum setup that shovels a bunch of monsters into the extra deck at once, it's not exactly gonna turn heads at the next regional now, is it? And real talk, why should you or I put more effort into making this card work than the developers did making this? Like, it's literally a collage of all the existing monster arts, and it just looks so terrible. They barely look like they're supposed to be in the same room together. Like, how do we expect our community to care about lore when you have examples like this floating around? It's bad. Alright, that's all the Zefra cards, but what do we do with them? Well, at the heart of the deck, we have an engine made to churn out material to make other summons happen. As with most things, the field spell is a big indicator of what the theme wants to do, and it wants rituals, fusions, synchros, and Xyz to come pouring out of your ears. But as a deck, it lacks the engine to really turbo out these cards. So we're gonna need to find what parts of these monsters' home archetypes we can incorporate into our own, find some other good pendulum cards we can use to bolster our lineup, and for the love of God, find a coherent win condition. So what can we play to help them out? Well, first off, we have those good link monsters I talked about earlier. Can't have a good pendulum summon without a good link monster, and thankfully, we have many to choose from. Beyond and Exceed the Pendulum are easy inclusions, arguably the premier link monsters for pendulum decks that need a little bit of a boost. But we also need to actually get the materials for them onto the board before they can actually work for us. Thankfully, Supreme King Dragon Darkworm and Abyss Actor Curtain Raiser are easy to summon, and even just fielding one of them pairs well with any of our normal summoned pendulums to make Beyond to get things started. But what about getting good scales? If we want to avoid the pend locks, we're gonna need someone else to pick up the slack. Most good high scales are also really tuned for their own particular archetype, so while we could still play those, ideally we want one that also helps us with our deck, and for that, I couldn't recommend a Symphonic Warrior Guitar enough. It can pitch a card from your hand, maybe even one of those Shadal Zephyras, to special summon a Symphonic Warrior from your deck, and the premium target has got to be Mice. Not only does it have a great level for synchro summoning, as well as a level 5 to pair with Zefraxa for that Exceed summoning stuff I was talking about, it also gives you an extra normal summon that turn for no extra charge. Symphonic Warrior Rocks is also a stellar synchro monster, getting you back cards from your face of extra deck among other great properties. What about our home cards? Do they have anything that can help with us? Well, Shadal Fusion is always a treat. Zephyrs already include every relevant attribute, so that entire roster of fusions is available to us. We can tech in monsters like Beast for a draw, or even Hedgehog to get us a relevant pendulum scale. Not bad. Tellarknights are difficult to weave in since many of their cards lock us into their own theme, but Caduceus is a generic you can make with any of our level 4 Zephyrs, which if you have the field spell gets you that draw and discard, then you can use its banish effect to get the pop from your Tellarknight pendulums. It's pretty neat. Ritual Beasts are a hard sell, but their new support cards might be able to help with that. Nekroz is odd, to say the least. You might want to look elsewhere for a ritual outlet. The Yang Xing cards in general aren't very synergistic, but their synchro monsters are amazing. Zefra Niu is already amazing for getting us Divine Strike, but it can also give us access to 9 pillars of the Yang Xing, which you can use to pop the Denglung, which can then either summon Zefra Niu for the search, or summon Bian, which can pair well with the Chiwen you may have sent to grave with the Denglung to make Herald of the Arclight for another negate that can't be destroyed by battle. And if it goes to the graveyard, hey, that's a ritual support for any of those that we tech in. As for a silly tech pick, well, I really do want to find a ritual theme that can work well with us, and the only thing I can think of is Nouvelles. Poissonnier does make for a complementary scale to Zefrath as an 8, and searches out the card we need to get our ritual summons started. It even resets itself to the scale if tributed, and it gives us even more of a reason to run set rotation. You get Table, they get Oracle, and now you're the only one that gets to set up shop. And if you get the Oracle, that ritual summon is also removal. Cheers! Alright, so that's all the info I have on Zefra, but how do they stack up against the Novascape? Novelty. While the idea of a card belonging to multiple archetypes nowadays feels like old hat, it was actually unheard of back in the day. Zefra was, at least on a large scale, the first archetype to incorporate monsters from existing archetypes and weld them into its own, leading the way for design that would be further expanded upon in World Legacy a few years later. But that's about as far as the innovation goes. The deck itself doesn't really push any boundaries or set any other kind of precedent, which feels really underwhelming considering it's the capstone of a whole storyline. Being a beacon when it comes to merging gameplay and story is something to be admired, but I can only really grant it a 3 in novelty. Objectivity. Well, the theme certainly has its high points, though they do have to be extracted from their original environment and taken into other decks to fully function. But even something like the Zefra Niu package is pretty tame by today's standards, and has fallen off in usage almost entirely. It also doesn't help that Pendulum has turned away from being a control deck now that it has fewer back row slots to work with. Its days of being a cool pendulum tech picker far from over, but I still wouldn't put it next to any of the game's greats, so I'm giving Zefra a 5 in objectivity. Versatility. not much gets out of this. As previously stated, the Zefra New package sometimes sees play in other Pendulum decks, and even sometimes sees play with Zefrath as a way to load it into the extra deck and set up a scale. But that's about it. The scales are meant only for Zefra, and their effects are only for their respective themes. Heck, sometimes the Zefra monsters don't even work well in their core archetypes. You know, the thing they really should actually excel at in this context. So Zefra are getting a 2 in versatility. Awesomeness. Yeah, this one's not looking good. Half the time it honestly feels like the deck is fighting itself more than the opponent, and that is a bad place to be in. It really feels like Zefra should have gotten its own series of extra deck monsters to coincide with its release, but with a level 11 rock that hardly functions as more than an enabler, and a Link 3 that infuriates me, there isn't much the deck can do or accomplish. So I'm giving Zefra a 1 in awesomeness, which means Zefra walk away with an 11 on the Nova scale. And that's all I have to say about Zefra. I hate to be so hard on another lore archetype, but honestly I feel like an archetype this modern should have been handled better. But that's the world we live in. However, with potentially more Terminal World packs just over the horizon, you never know what could be in store for the theme. Granted, its scales will make it difficult to make future support for, but I'm confident that there's enough unexplored design space for the creators to make some cool mechanics and unlock those seraphic warriors. And it better have answers about Zefra Metaltron. If I don't learn what's going on by the end of 2024, I am going to terminate that thought before I say something I regret. But now, I want to hear what you all have to say. Do you agree that Zefra isn't power scaled properly, or do you think you have what it takes to be the chosen one? And which one's your favorite? I'm pretty partial to Zefrath. It's got a cool mecha kaiju thing going on. Let me know your favorites down below, and if you haven't already, please make sure to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to share this video with somebody you know who loves Yu-Gi-Oh! It really does a lot to help me out. Today's episode is brought to you by my lovely patrons, as well as the wonderful people over at Dragon Shield. Get the sleeves as strong as dragon scales, and save 5% on your order by using coupon code GoldenNova at checkout. Today's episode was also brought to you by my lovely patrons, including this month's illustrious Quasar Commanders Frankie and Marluxia is a Girl, Nebula Navigator's 3rd Dynasty, Ada Basilisk, Adam Zajdel, Andrew Newman, Kane Senpai, Chibi Gohan, Christopher Fuss, Clockswork, Dark Dragon X830, EmonyChan, Eric, Aaron the World Breaker, Garland Chaos, Genesis Yu-Gi-Oh!, Green Knight, Great Big Pillock, Hair Bear, Harry the Ominous Benefactor, Howling Zangetsu, Hydrocraft 135, Iron Zero, Iskander 711, Mana Charge, Marion James E. Picata, Mega Combi, Millennia Asta, Muzuki Clark, Nathan Vig, Natiel Lee Alexander, Orozco 09096, Panther J, Rebel King Lucifer, Red Eyes Jackalow, RJ the Jank Monarch, Sammy Haim, Serenity Towns, Sir Knight JCB, Sim Antares, The Wizard Moose, URTV667 and Xander Wolfensberger, Cosmic Crusaders Alpha Sly, Almento 5010, A Random Pup, Ariel Kersey, Beluga Masta, Blitzwolf, Blue Gem, Borger with a Shotgun, Chaz Ghost, Corbinisms, Danny Bound, Dr. Reaper RIP, Drachenwald, Eki Bullock, Eva Padilla, Hike Boyagian, Herbal D, Inblink, Jester Designs, Kale the Dragon, Carp, Kevon Public, King Scarlet Yu-Gi-Oh!, Lemon Yu-Gi-Oh!, Lord Whoop-De-Doo, Manga Pages, Matt Simmons, Mick Spoofy, Michael Shimabukuro, Mustafa Aiden, Nitromo, Shizuki Nijimura, Sophie, apparently, Stephen Williamson, Taylor Seymour, the legendary Raven, and Zaldreka, as well as the lovely Starlight Explorers you see on screen now. If you'd like to help me in my journey to cover all of Yu-Gi-Oh's archetypes, get my videos early, be a part of these credits, and many other awesome perks, it would mean the world to me if you checked out the link to my Patreon in the description or consider joining as a YouTube member. And if you'd like to get acquainted with the lore of the Duel Terminal, check out this playlist where I cover it. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.